Good morning on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning for, I think, what will be a tremendously insightful conversation and very important timing. Thanks to Joshua Huminski for assembling this panel today of some good friends of the Center, folks we've heard from before, and at a very opportune time to revisit with these renowned experts on military adaptation and the nature of warfare as we come to the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Today, we're going to focus less on the geopolitics and the economic statecraft and more on the military aspects of the conflict and the lessons we've learned from observing that conflict. We're delighted to have General David Barno and Dr. Nora Bensahel, both visiting professors of strategic studies and senior fellows at the Merrill Center at Johns Hopkins University, and Michael Kofman, research program director in Russia studies at CNA, and folks whose writing we've followed very closely for several years, and whose writing has really enlightened our thinking and understanding about military tactics and what we can observe from conflicts like this in terms of how militaries are adapting, what it might mean for the near and medium-term futures. We have a lot to talk about today, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Joshua to get us right into the conversation. Thank you to our featured speakers for being here. Joshua, over to you.
Thank you so much, Representative Nye. For the audience members who are there, please do look to submit questions through the question and answer feature within Zoom. This is going to be a very interactive discussion, but I'm very excited to lead off and turn it straight to Mr. Kofman. You recently had a great Twitter thread about the spring offensive, which many people were expecting to happen, but you have said is already underway. I'm curious what you can say about the offensive, where it stands right now, and how that reflects the states of both the Russian and Ukrainian militaries as they stand right now.
Sure. Thanks, Joshua. So, I think broadly to summarize, heading into the winter, the Russian military was at its most vulnerable point. It suffered 2 defeats in consecutive offensive operations by Ukraine, one in Kharkiv, the other in Kherson. Although Kherson proved to be a rather difficult attritional fight for Ukrainian forces, they were able to press the Russian military out of that foothold. Now, Russian forces following mobilization stabilized their lines and began entrenching. And they substantially increased the amount of military power they actually had in Ukraine, the ratio of forces to the terrain they were seeking to defend. And the front, in some respects, shrunk. Now, the Ukrainian military, I think, was expected to press the Russian military over the course of the winter, but they also focused on force reconstitution. Beyond a couple axes of attack, key towns like Crimea, they found themselves battling against Wagner PMCs, many of them taken out of the Russian prison systems, in an attritional fight for the city of Bakhmut. The Ukrainian military, I think, was looking to set forces aside for a major offensive operation in the spring, which we can talk a bit about later, but is much anticipated. The Russian military changed commanders, it changed leadership, and I think began to prosecute a winter offensive beginning with the last week of January. And this offensive was focused on trying to seize the Donbass. In fact, this seems to be the minimal war aim for the Russian leadership, and it has been the main aim of their offensives going all the way back to April. The problem for the Russian military is that although they've been able to replace the sort of structural manpower deficit that they had, meaning solve the quantitative side of the equation, they have real problems with force quality. You can't replace lost experienced regulars, junior officers, and leaders with individuals that you've mobilized who have had at most 3 months worth of training or refresh training. They've also lost a lot of equipment, and they expended a tremendous amount of artillery ammunition over the course of last year. Okay, the Russian military was originally a partial mobilization army. It didn't mobilize to invade Ukraine. So a big deficit of manpower, and they were compensating for it over the course of last spring and summer by leveraging their advantage in artillery fire. But that meant they spent too much artillery ammunition and are either going to have to ration now or very soon. Because of that, Russian military offensive potential is limited. Last point on this. The Russian offensive in practice seems to be around 5 to 6 distributed axes of attack, running from southern Donetsk all the way to Luhansk. And it does include the Battle of Bakhmut and several other battles. In this respect, it may not look like a traditional offensive or what many folks had expected. That is one operation with a large number of forces massed to try to attain advantage on a specific part of the front. That said, while I think the Russian military is at best going to make incremental gains when we look at territory, we often select for territory because that is the one metric or measure that we can see. What we often don't see is what's happening to the two forces, right? And so we have to be frank about the uncertainty of the state of the Russian military, but also the impact that defending against this offensive could have on the Ukrainian military. So you can read it different ways. Optimistically, Ukraine will be able to defend, then take the initiative later in the spring, prosecute its own offensive, likely in the south, attempt a major breakthrough. I think this is very likely, but the question is, how will the Ukrainian military be impacted by the Russian offensive, and in terms of losses of equipment, ammunition, manpower? And last comment that I think close out my remarks. The truth is that a year into this war, neither the Russian or Ukrainian military looked the way they did when the war began. Both have suffered significant losses. Both have come up with ways to replace those losses with mobilized personnel. Ukraine taking in a huge variety of Western equipment, establishing a variegated force, definitely from the standpoint of different types of equipment across the board. Russian military doing much the same in terms of manpower, right? And so we have to be frank that both forces have changed considerably since the beginning of the war. Okay, I'd like to turn it back over to you because I'd love to hear from my colleagues Nora and Dave.
Oh, that's a fantastic opening. Thank you very much. I mean, turning directly over to Dr. Bensahel and General Barno, I'd very much like to hear your thoughts. When we sat down 6 months ago, we were taking preliminary lessons about what we had seen from the Russian-Ukrainian military in terms of adaptations. And where we are a year into it, I'm curious what your biggest takeaways are from the lessons thus far that we've seen from both forces and how it is playing out today, to Mr. Kofman's comments.
Maybe I'll jump in first with a couple of thoughts and then turn it over to Dave. I think a lot of the lessons that we talked about 6 months ago remain true today. And, in talking about those offensives and how the conduct of the battle is going, one of the things that we emphasized is the increasing transparency of the battlefield of both sides, but particularly the Ukrainian side with the advantages that they've gotten from US satellite systems, most famously Starlink from Elon Musk, although that is not as much as it used to be, really being able to see and identify where Russian forces are and leverage that information, sometimes which is also being gathered by citizens using their cell phone and being fed into that broader network. So I think that absolutely remains true. I think one of the things that we didn't foresee, because we weren't focused on, it was still 6 months in, it wasn't clear what was going to happen in the fall last time we talked, is the incredible constraints on logistics facing both sides. Russia has it worse for all the reasons that Michael just mentioned. But even the US and the West have had trouble generating the kinds of ammunition flows and providing the other types of supporting logistics. NATO and the US and Europeans together have kept that stuff flowing, but we're starting to run out of it on our end. And the longer this war goes on, the harder it will be because of constraints on our own defense industrial base to actually keep replenishing at that rate. Again, compared to Russia, I like where Ukraine and NATO sit, but that was something, the fact that this is clearly going to continue is clearly, this war is not going to be over anytime soon. That's still true. We said that 6 months ago, that's still true today. Those logistical dependencies and the defense industrial base becomes an issue as well.
Yeah, I could just build on that a bit. One of the fascinating aspects of this war, as in all wars, is it goes through a series of different phases that look much different from each other. The phases that we've seen play out here in the last 3, 4, 5 months don't look very much at all like what things stood at the 4-month mark or 5-month mark late last summer in Ukraine. One of the striking things that a number of commentators have noted is this now is beginning to look like World War I, that there's a trench line snaking across the battlefield there on both sides are hunkering down and digging in, trying to find some protection from the immense amount of firepower that's being levied by both the Ukrainians and the Russians, and really we're reverting back to forms of warfare that we thought were, vestiges of, a very, very distant past, 100 years ago. And that's fascinating to watch. Again, if we were sitting here in July or August of last year, I don't think too many of us really would have anticipated that. There is a danger that the war is moving into what could be a prolonged stalemate. I think these nascent offensive, defensive thrusts by both sides, what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 months, is some probable fencing before some major decision point here when the weather is good enough in the spring to support an offensive. And whoever seizes the initiative at that point in time, I think that's the next big move to watch. I'm guessing that could well be the Ukrainians. It's going to be very interesting to watch how they begin to integrate in the up to 200 plus main battle tanks that they're now getting from the United States, Germany, other European countries, that are going to give them some really powerful modern striking power on the battlefield that they really haven't had this degree of before. One of the interesting prognostications, of course, over the last year is that this may be the death knell of the main battle tank, and I think we're in the mode now of saying it not so fast. There are plenty of offensive opportunities for tanks to actually show their capabilities on a battlefield once a breakthrough takes place, and if they're used properly with a lot of combined armed support. So that's one issue, is these various phases of how the offense and defense is playing out. I think we've had a number of other surprises as we've watched the role of air power in this conflict. I think has been fascinating in terms of what didn't happen. The dog that didn't bark, much like in a way the cyber campaign. Everyone expected an overwhelming cyber assault that would take down the Ukrainian networks very early on. That failed to materialize, probably due to some very good intelligence work and support by the West. But even in the air, there was an expectation. Certainly, my Air Force friends would have expected the Russian Air Force to dominate the Ukrainians, to wipe out their air power on the ground, to be preeminent on the battlefield, to have achieved air supremacy by this point in time, and none of those things have happened. So the interesting aspect of this war, also with some insights to the future, is the air is going to be contested. There may be a need to accept denial of airspace as an objective, as opposed to having air supremacy. So lots of really interesting, fascinating, twists going on in terms of how we would have envisioned warfare if we were sitting here a year ago.
Well, there's a number of things that came out of that, just a few remarks, which is fantastic. It's almost as if you read my questions before I had them. I wanted to start with the sort of the depth of the tank, which was much heralded last year, but obviously premature, and the viability of sort of maneuver warfare reflecting in this conflict. As you said, we've sort of regressed almost First World War tactics with very fixed positions, trench lines. You even see the dragon's teeth and whatnot being deployed out there. What are the lessons that you would draw from this in terms of maneuver warfare and combined arms, and what it looks like for the future that you see from the Ukrainian side, but from the Russian side as well? I'd love your thoughts, Mr. Kofman, but also what does that tell us for NATO?
So if you'd like me to chime in first, regarding maneuver versus maybe attritional warfare. Look, in this war, it's clear that maneuver warfare has been successful. To be perfectly honest, that war was made easy by extensive attrition. Okay, and we can draw different lessons from that. Now, it's clear that both sides are operating in a mutually air-denied environment. I do actually think there's been far more air power involvement in this war than meets the eye, especially early on, but it's very difficult to tell that from open sources. That said, if you look from at least my point of view on the distribution of technology, it makes maneuver much harder because it's much easier to find and fix a target. It's much harder to impose dilemmas on your opponent. Frankly, they see you coming. It's very easy for opponents to detect various entrenchments. It's very hard to come up with TTPs that deal with a battlefield where there's distributed high fidelity sensors. Drones are used as expendable munitions. They have a pretty short shelf life. Electronic warfare has a strong role to play on the modern battlefield, as this war reflects. But you can make a safe counter argument too, which is, are we generalizing too much from just the context of this war? Perhaps neither side has sufficient qualitative advantage in this conflict, the kind that the United States tries to attain. Perhaps neither side is able to put the pieces together to engage in maneuver warfare. The Russian military and the Ukrainian military are both successors to the Soviet military, which is fundamentally an artillery army culture with lots of tanks. They're both, first and foremost, artillery armies. So in the absence of other options, they're very likely to regress to the mean of leveraging artillery firepower and pursuing more attritional warfare than necessarily combined arms maneuver. So that's another point I want to make. So we want to be careful that we don't learn too many things and some things that may not be true. That said, in general, I've long been in the camp that we need to make peace with attrition, that major conventional wars of this kind, beyond the initial operation, do very much come down to attrition, replacement of manpower, material, and ammunition, okay? And the force that reconstitutes best over time can begin to take the advantage and impose real dilemmas on its opponent. Beyond that, when it comes to individual platforms, I'm really fascinated in how we interpret the data. Personally, I don't think that much new has been said about the tank since 1973. I don't understand why anybody would want to get out of the tank and get into something that's less survivable, less protective, and less versatile. I think all those things seem to have a shorter lifespan on the battlefield. And if you want to get out of vehicles because you think they're vulnerable and be dismounted infantry on the modern battlefield, well, you can look at the Battle of Bakhmut and see how well that's going for Wagner PMCs and the large casualties they've taken there. So it's clear that the only place more dangerous than being in a tank is being outside of the tank, at least from my point of view. That said, I'll close on this. The data is really fascinating to me. Is the high loss of tanks in this war a suggestion that they're vulnerable or that they're very useful and that both armies are depending on them, right? How do we interpret those numbers? From my point of view, it's more the latter, that the numbers we see are more reflective of their utility and the fact that both armies extensively depend on them, not necessarily so much of their vulnerability.
Dr. Bensahel, building off of that, where do you see the lessons for the NATO in particular? Because the NATO construct and force design was very much built for a Soviet and then Russian military. And the assumptions that we had, and myself included, was that the Russian military performed far better than it has. And to Michael's comment, the NATO construct and American construct is very much that overmatch capacity. So looking forward, where do we see the planning, design, and the lessons for NATO going?
Well, I think that, you know, much of that obviously will depend on how and when and where this war ends, right? What, you know, when it's over, what NATO's assessment is of what it needs its force structure to be, what, you know, obviously, I think everybody agrees it's going to take the Russians quite some time to reconstitute after the war, again, whatever the ending ends up being. I think the lessons that NATO will take from it is that the force design, at least for you know, the next 5-10 years, maybe, you know, perhaps even longer, is that the best way to defend Europe is to just have very strong defenses. You know, this to basically make the costs of any invasion of NATO territory incredibly costly for the Russians, and NATO has the capability to do that. You know, the Europeans are putting more money into defense. We'll see how much that actually gains them in capabilities. It's obviously an important first step. But the US Army still has an incredibly large role to play in ensuring the defense of some of those frontline states. I think that I've heard too many people in the US military and in the national security community drawing the conclusion from this war that Russia is not going to be a threat moving forward, right? We thought the Russians were this big threat. They turned out not to be. The Ukrainians are doing well, therefore, and we know it's going to take Russia a long time to reconstitute, therefore we don't have to worry about anything that Russia is doing. And I find that line of thinking quite dangerous, actually, because one of the things we know from throughout history is that declining powers are dangerous. And they're more dangerous the faster they decline. So even though we could make a rational argument that, well, after Ukraine, you know, Russia, Putin, his successor, whoever, isn't going to invade NATO, I think that would be the wrong conclusion to draw. I think that the threat in terms of military capabilities will be less in certain areas as Russia needs to reconstitute, but that NATO really is going to have very strong defenses to continue to try to deter any Russian behavior, even given the losses that it will take and the reconstitution problems it will have.
Both you and Dr. Bensahel, General Barno, referenced the defense industrial base as being a key component for this fight going forward. It's interesting that the drawdown on the stockpiles for both supplying Ukraine, but also backfilling Europe has become a very considerable issue. We've seen discussions in the United States about restarting artillery production, but equally on the Russian side, we've seen questions and concerns about the ability to meet demands of the Russian side. has the defense industrial base become a sort of long pole in the tent that we didn't anticipate in terms of supporting a conventional fight in the long term? And what do we need to do about that, both now to supply Ukraine in the coming months, but also in terms of the longer term for defense planning?
I think that's one of the seams or flaws in U.S. defense planning that this war has revealed in stark terms, that it's obvious that the degree of consumption of munitions in Ukraine is orders of magnitude higher than we've seen maybe since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which evidenced the same kind of massive attrition and massive expenditures of weaponry that kind of shook up the U.S. military and certainly the U.S. Army, would cause them to rethink their doctrine of what it would take to fight and win in Western Europe against a Warsaw Pact invasion. And I think this particular war is going to have the same effect in terms of thinking about both attrition, which Michael's talked about, and how you actually withstand those kind of losses. And I actually think the U.S. military is very brittle in that respect, and that it has not actually experienced any significant attrition in the last 20 years of war. You'd have to go back to the Vietnam era, 50 years back to see that, which is outside of living memory of anybody in uniform. So it's brittle in that respect. And it's also, I think, underestimates the degree to which its current munition stocks would be adequate in a conflict. As you point out, Joshua, we've actually shifted a goodly number of our reserve munitions into Europe and now into Ukrainian hands. The Europeans are doing the same, and there's a mad scramble on to get those production lines expanded here in the next several years. Fortunately, I think this has been a very useful yellow flag for the U.S. military and even for the U.S. Congress to recognize our defense industrial base capabilities have atrophied and eroded immensely from what they were even 25, 30 years ago, certainly from the Cold War era. Both the number of suppliers and the very tiny numbers of munitions that are on a long-term sustained production rate that can't rapidly be expanded. And so that's going to be one of the big shakeups I think we're going to see as an aftermath of that war coming home here to the U.S. is building in the need for expansibility, both in terms of munitions and rapid expansibility into contracts that U.S. military lets with industry out there, but also in terms of weapon system. There's now kind of a realization that if we took those kind of losses in tanks, if we took those kind of losses in helicopters, how would we generate those capabilities? And again, those production lines aren't built to do that at all. And so I think rethinking this and building this into, building expansibility into how we contract for both munitions and capabilities platforms in the U.S. military is going to be key going forward.
Just very quickly, I'm worried that the lesson that we will take in the U.S. will just be limited to ammunition and other types of, the things that we're expending right now in Ukraine. If you look at the delays in fielding naval ships because of the contraction of the defense industrial base, you're talking for many platforms, 5 years, 7 years, 9-year delays between when you decide to purchase a ship and when you field it. That is going to be unacceptable for the United States in any future war. And so I think that the good lesson from this is about the rate of expenditures of artillery and ammunition. And I think we are going to try to increase those capacities, but that's not sufficient, right? What we're learning about this should be extended to the fragility of the defense industrial base as a whole. And that, because of this very stark lesson that major conventional war involves attrition of both people and stuff.
Michael, if I may, how have we seen the Russians adapt to this attritional rate of fighting, both in terms of, last year they were expending on the order of 20 to 30,000 rounds of artillery shells to offset manpower weaknesses, to where they've shifted to reducing that consumption rate. How has the Russian defense industrial base adapted, and how is that affecting their operations today?
Well, I mean, they've had to do what others have had to do in this kind of war, which is mobilize defense industrial production, go to triple shifts, start mobilizing the economy and putting it on a war footing. I think it's been rather challenging for them, right? And they were in some respects better positioned than many countries in order to be able to do it, which makes me wonder how well we would be able to do it if a month into the war, when the initial sort of operational warfighting problem was resolved, win or lose or draw, and the war continues nonetheless, and the U.S. realized that, guess what, it's not going to be a 1-month war. How long will it then take us to mobilize if it's so hard for Russia to do it? Yes, they've tried to crank out as much ammunition equipment as they could. Very quickly, they discovered that the losses from the war, the equipment that they have to repair, right, impinges on their ability to produce additional equipment or to pull equipment out of storage, because the same people are kind of involved in those tasks, right? So suddenly you quickly find yourself in the churn of repair yards for tanks and mechanized equipment for armored fighting vehicles, while also you want to get the equipment you have out of storage, right, out of conservation, and put that equipment to work, and then also try to mobilize production of additional equipment. And you can only do that to a limited extent, as the United States quickly figured out that with our anemic artillery production, we can ramp it up by 40% this year, and then we can ramp it up by over 300% over 2 years from now, which is really great news if we had a time machine and we can go to 2025 and get the artillery ammunition from that future and then bring it back to the war right now, because Ukrainians need it this year rather than 2025, right? And that's also a story with Europeans, who actually produce more artillery ammo than we do, or at least they would if they had invested more into ramping up that production than did earlier. So this is a near to medium term problem. And you find that the near to medium term actually is like about 8 months, and 8 months on a large scale conventional war, a lot of things can happen in that time period, right? So when the defense sector tells you I have good news that you're going to get 300 to 500% additional artillery production 2+ years from now, that good news comes with a heavy dose of bad news. So the Russian military's tried to adapt, but they're very much suffering from the implications of trying to sustain this kind of war. The Russian military is not the Soviet army, right? It was substantially reformed. The reforms, I think, in many ways built it out much more for a short, sharp war with NATO, with a hedge that the military could mobilize in the event of a larger conflict like this. But it was designed to mobilize 2 months in advance of a war, not 8 months into the war, once the force and its best equipment had been expended and most of the better officers had been lost. Nobody mobilizes 8 months into a war that they're losing, right? Ideally. So in that regard, they did a lot of things wrong, even according to their own plans and strategy. But there are valuable lessons for us here. And I think very much not just about, ammunition and defense industrial base. I think if you look at the Russian military, a lot of things that we typically use as bill pairs, maintenance, sustainment, stockpiles, right? These are the issues that were their main deficits. It was much less modernization. There's much more of these aspects of the force that weren't up to par. Readiness was a huge issue for them. It's a big issue for any military that's based on mobilization, but it's a big problem for them. And readiness padding was a big problem for them, right? And I have a lot of colleagues, right? And surely nobody pads readiness in the US military, right? Obviously not to the extent of Russia. I don't like making false equivalents, but let's be frank with each other. We know readiness is an issue too. And last point on this, we should be wary of our own defense community's technology fetishism, okay? Don't buy into the notion that HIMARS was a silver bullet. Does it look like it's won the war? It's certainly made an impact in kind. But to be very honest, its net effect has been overstated, and it's operating under very contrived circumstances where we can do targeting with essentially untouched remote sensing assets and what have you, which wouldn't never happen in a real war with China or Russia, right? So be careful of the notion that there's any capability we can buy that will sort of magically resolve this problem, or that there are these kind of capability-based game changers that can substantially get us out of the question of attrition and preparing for this kind of war. And the same thing goes for all the firepower we have displaced in our Air Force, right? We can't assume that we're going to have air superiority right off the bat. We can't assume that the context of the world will give us 3 months to establish air superiority before anything else happens either. Like it might be Iraq or it might be Afghanistan. The next adversary, that fight might not be like that at all, right? And most importantly, we can't assume that we're actually not going to run faster out of JASM ERs and other harder to replace capabilities, right? That might actually be the thing that gets expended first and that it gets expended the most. Yeah, I'll close on that.
General Barno, I want to turn to the Ukrainian military specifically, because what we've seen is the rapid ingest of a diversity of weapon systems, platforms, and technologies, and the forthcoming ingestion of even more advanced systems, the Leopard, the M1 Abrams, the Patriot battery. I'm curious your thoughts on how the Ukrainian military has adapted to the infusion of these systems, the potential friction points going forward as these systems increase in complexity, and how the force may change from what we can call a Franken force to something that is by design capable of defending Ukraine, but possibly deterring Russia in the future.
Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. I think let me take a bite at a couple of those. Dr. Bensahel and I wrote a book in 2020 called Adaptation Under Fire. And in that book, we asked, is the U.S. military adaptable enough to, be successful in the wars of the future? And the upshot is we thought that the U.S. military in 2020 may have been the most adaptable military in the world. Today, we would say the Ukrainian military is the most adaptable military in the world, with very little discussion, I think. And what they've been able to do in the last year now, and even before that, that we probably have put less of a intrusive look at the several years leading up to this conflict and what happened inside the Ukrainian military, then how much the U.S. and to some degree Western Europeans were helpful in shaping that military and retraining it and preparing it for a different kind of conflict. What the Ukrainians themselves learned from the loss of Crimea and watching Russian aggression in other areas. This was a very adaptive force when the war started. It's an even more adaptive force today, and they have been, I think, remarkably successful. I think have shocked a lot of American military observers in how well they have brought in, as you note, the Franken-Force combination of every different nation's technology, dip tanks from 3 or 4 different countries. They put U.S. high-speed anti-radiation missiles on Russian MiG-29 fighters that they were flying in the aircraft, and no one thought that was even possible. They've re-engineered software for systems. They've made their own adjustments to weaponry they've gotten in from the West to make it more effective and make it blend into their command and control system. So they have been incredibly adaptive, and that's one of the reasons I think they've been as successful as they have been. I think they will continue to have challenges with that, and the logistics challenges. We've heard a lot about the M1 Abrams tank and how difficult it is to maintain and keep that logistically supplied. True statement, but I'm certain the Ukrainians would rather have it than not have it and have to deal with those problems. So a lot of the logistic support and the challenges there will have to rely on the West and the United States still pushing as much logistics into Ukraine as possible. Particularly each of these tanks is going to have a different series of maintenance spares that are required to keep the tanks up and running. They will all run on the same fuel ostensibly, so that's not a problem. They have NATO standard ammunition that they're using for their main guns. So there's a lot of commonality there, fortunately. But again, the Ukrainians are going to take what they've got. They're going to adapt it. They're going to use it more effectively than we could have possibly imagined. And that's one of the lessons I think that has been a big positive surprise in the last year.
Dr. Bensahel, I want to pick up on that last point there. And there seems to be, certainly in the commentariat within Washington, D.C. policy spaces, is that the bulk of Ukrainian successes thus far is the product of Western assistance and Western training or advisory. But it seems to diminish the agency of the Ukrainians themselves and their own actual adaptation on the battlefield. I'm curious if you can comment on that, because it seems to place the onus on the West and saying, haha, look how successful we are, but detracting from what the Ukrainians have managed to do over the last year.
I couldn't agree with you more. What the Ukrainians have managed to do is utterly remarkable, given all of the constraints that they're under, given the, as Dave was just saying, the need to put all of these different systems together. I will say that Western support has been necessary for Ukraine to be able to keep that up. But it's not sufficient, right? The West doesn't get credit for what the Ukrainians are doing, with all of this equipment. Western help has been, vital. They wouldn't be able to keep fighting if we weren't helping with the ammunition flows, artillery shells, and so on. But what the Ukrainians are managing to do on the battlefield with what we're providing, with the relatively limited training that we provided during the first few months of the war, that's ramped up, and that will, we'll see that come into effect this year. But the Ukrainians deserve the bulk of the credit. It is their will to fight, and the fact that they are fighting for their very survival as a state, and the way that President Zelensky has managed that, along with the adaptability of the forces, the mobilization of the population. Ukraine certainly has its challenges, but what they've been able to accomplish on the battlefield has been, I think, really quite extraordinary compared to what you would have predicted beforehand and what many people did predict. But again, they need help to do it, and the West is continuing to provide that help. So I don't want to minimize the role of outside support, but it is not correct to say, well, the West is winning against Russia. The Ukrainians are doing that with blood and treasure every day.
I'm gonna have to give credit to Mr. Kofman for raising that point in a message directly to me, so I can't claim credit for that insight there. But I do want to build off of that with you, Mr. Kofman. We focus so much, and you're absolutely right, about the techno fetishism that the West has about silver bullet weapon systems. I'm curious about what we can learn from the military leadership failures or shortcomings that we've seen at sort of the strategic level, obviously with Gerasimov being appointed as commander of the ground forces, replacing Surovikin, and how much of Russia's poor performance can be placed on the political shortcomings of the military leadership, but then also the inverse of that, of what successes we can place at the hands of Ukraine's military leadership by converse.
Yeah, that's a hard one to unpack. So I would say early on, in the initial period of war, that is the first 3 weeks, and more importantly, the first week that was decisive, the main issue were Russian political assumptions and a completely unworkable concept of operations, because I think many of us expected a combined arms operation whose center of gravity was the Ukrainian military, rather than the Russian military essentially driving in administratively, attempting to thunder run it and pursuing a decapitation strike, going straight to the capital and trying to either capture or unseat Zelensky, assuming that they wouldn't have much of a fight, assuming that the main phase of combat operations would last barely 2 weeks, not having the logistics or a lot of other things prepared and set aside for anything beyond that, and also having those kind of rules of engagement for their units. You know, we have a lot of data about the force structure, about actually how the columns were formed invading, and many of them even had Rosguardia, the Russian National Guard, in the lead, assuming that they wouldn't encounter much resistance and planning to bypass cities. So in that regard, big parts of the Russian force were essentially, to be perfectly honest, thrown away. It's not to take anything against, not take anything away from the Ukrainian resistance, but even so, in the initial period of war, it was a pretty close run affair. I think a lot of folks don't appreciate how contingent it was in those early days. And it hinged a lot on Zelensky's decision to stay and what individual commanders chose to do, and how Ukrainian volunteers and Ukrainian veterans showed up to fight and defend the capital that actually was relatively undefended on the night of the war, to be perfectly honest. That was one of the reasons I think folks like me thought the Ukrainian odds looked grim. There wasn't much evidence of systematic Ukrainian preparation to defend back then. That being said, when the Russian military then reconstituted and tried to fight, you know, starting in April, focusing more on their artillery advantage, you saw the real issues were first and foremost quality of the force, big problems in the fundamentals and level of training, right? A good army can try to compensate for a bad plan, but the Russian military both had a terrible plan and it wasn't that good of an army, okay? Second, you saw a real rigid structure still in terms of command and control, okay? And real difficulty to adapt, and leadership that didn't really know its own force very well. The way it was trying to command and use battalion tactical groups, they weren't meant for that. They weren't equipped for that. They weren't supplied for it. And challenge was knowing its own force and the trade-offs that they made in their own force design. That was pretty clear. Third, you know, you had a system that didn't punish incompetence and didn't reward initiative. And that was very clear. So one of the biggest problems in the Russian military, from my point of view, were actually all software. And the reason why I rant about tech fetishism is because we always draw our first lessons looking at hardware, right? What was the missile fail rate? Oh, their vehicles weren't modernized enough. You know, they're only 1990s level standard and ours have thermal panoramic sights. This is all going to go better for us, right? And this kind of stuff. And to me, the lowest level intelligence conversation is about the things, right? That's the part of the conversation I actually find intellectually the least satisfying. What you saw in the Russian military on the software side, they did not have the organizational adaptations to put a lot of theory into practice. They struggled on scaling operations. They had concepts for employment of weapons and capabilities, but they couldn't do it in practice. They didn't have experience. And they observed us and they took some of the wrong lessons from watching us and how we did it, right? And how our force matured with this technology. And they found out that when it came to the actual war, they lacked a lot of the software to be able to employ the technology they had acquired. On the Ukrainian side, I'll go very briefly because I don't want to take too much time. I know we don't save time for Q&A. Some points. You know, first of all, Ukrainian success, to be honest, are not because we trained them in the intervening years. Oh, I wish that story was true. And I think it probably is true for Ukrainian special forces. And I know we are thirsty for a military that has done well and has done well because we have trained them, especially after Iraq and Afghanistan, okay? But the reality is, I don't think so. And the Ukrainians are not doing better because they're much more like us. Actually, in terms of force structure, they're much closer to the Russian military. In the one manner in which I think they're closer maybe to us is where it does really matter, which is military culture. The culture in the Ukrainian military is different than the culture in the Russian armed forces. They treat their soldiers differently. They're not cynical. They don't expend manpower the way the Russian military does. They try to preserve the force. They have accountability in the Russian military. Zaluzhin in December said that over the course of the war, 10 generals he had fired, okay? That is a military that prizes veterancy, that has a horizontal decision-making process where veterans, no matter the rank, get input into the mission. It is a military that does mission command by default, in large part because some of the, some of the strictures of command and control, the bureaucracy and hierarchy isn't quite there the way it is in our military. And I've sometimes joked that if we were to push DoD process onto the Ukrainian military, they'd probably lose this war. That's my own personal interpretation. That's one honest view. But that's what I saw. I went to Kherson myself back in October. I was there near the front lines, and I had some impression of how they were doing things. And that's what I thought. That the last thing they need is for us to actually show them how we do it, because I don't think it would lead to their success. That said, it's a very flexible military, but also comes with its own challenges, right? Logistics is much harder for them. Internal distribution is much harder for them. And coordination for operations above battalion level is much harder for them too. You see, they've done much better on the defense. It's harder for them on the offense. Anyway, I'll leave it at that because it's a great conversation, but I could take up all the time just going down this rabbit hole.
Oh, I kind of want to go down that rabbit hole with Dr. Bensahel starting and then General Barno as well. The software aspect of what we've seen and the adaptation of the Ukrainian military, what lessons does that hold for the software of America's military and NATO? I mean, you write fantastically in your book about how America's military has adapted, but also hasn't adapted, the role that leadership plays in that, the role that culture plays on that. I'm curious what lessons you can draw or are appropriate for America's and NATO's military in that software component.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I just build off of what Michael just said in terms of the importance of the culture and of the leadership, right? I mean, I think we all agree, and Michael just said, if Zelensky hadn't stuck around in those first few days and said, I need ammunition, not a ride, this war might look very different. I mean, a classic example right there. I also, by the way, I completely agree with Michael's assessment that DoD processes would be stifling some of the very advantages that the Ukrainians have. We can joke about that and laugh about that, but there's a serious point of concern there. One of the things that I was thinking back in the fall, I had the opportunity to travel to NATO and brief some NATO leaders on this, is that I worry in a future war that we will look more like Russia does on the battlefield in certain key respects than the Ukrainians do today. Precisely because we have a culture that prizes mission command in theory, but doesn't always in practice. We rely on a very heavy reliance on technology that is at the end of its technological curve, right? We keep the Ford class carriers are a great example, not relevant to the war in Ukraine, but where you're just squeezing out little additional bits of capability. Yes, it's going to be better than the past aircraft carriers, but not in a game-changing way, while at the same time, we do have these game-changing technologies that are coming along. So I worry that we're not adaptable in the US military enough to learn a lot of the lessons we should be learning from the war in Ukraine, right? One of the things I think we talked about in the last time we met, and I think is still very true today, is that this is a war that has huge implications for the United States. Sometimes, and Michael cautioned correctly, sometimes it's hard to piece out exactly what those are. But in a very similar way to the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which really shaped how the US Army thought about fighting for the next 20 years in its doctrine of air-land battle, we have an opportunity here to learn some of the changes we need to make in that software about how we operate, how we bring up junior forces, the level of decentralization that we push down to lower levels. And I think even so in some of the technology issues as well, in terms of decisions about what types of technologies we procure, not necessarily the inherent capabilities of those technologies themselves.
General Barno, if I could build off of what Dr. Bensahel was just referencing about that sort of the impact of the 73 war and air-land battle and the concepts that drove NATO and American force planning, what you see as potentially that next evolution in wake of, granted, we don't know how the war in Ukraine is going to end, but is likely going to see a materially weakened for a period of time Russia. What is going to be that governing doctrine or approach that integrates the next generation technology, that evolves the software and shapes that planning for the next 5, 10, 15 years for NATO as it looks towards Russia?
I think for the United States, one of the challenges that we have is that, and within the U.S. military, is that you're looking at two very different theaters of conflict that you have to be prepared for. The Western Pacific against a potential China threat, and that's a maritime theater that has immensely different demands and different logistics requirements and different parameters than a continental theater, the European theater, against a Russia that has proved itself to be an aggressor in this current war and in many other instances over the last 15 years. So the U.S. military is going to have to juggle how it prepares for both of those and draw what common ground it can find from watching essentially a land war in Ukraine to help inform both how it prepares to defend in Europe in the future and on other continental fights, but also to think about the Pacific. So I think it's going to be interesting to kind of crosswalk that, because the national security strategy, national defense strategy in the U.S. both cite that China is the pacing threat, that's the biggest concern, number one priority for the U.S. military. How do you take lessons from a Ukraine war that is very different than a fight, in the Western Pacific, in and around perhaps Taiwan or in some of the other areas there, and apply those lessons? So one of the first things I would say is I hope this conflict provides the U.S. military a chance to take a dose of humility about its ability to actually, as one of our friends says, awesome its way to victory in a future conflict against any adversary out there, because we're just that good. We're the finest military in the history of the world, as some leaders have said, which is almost laughable if you look at the historical examples out there. So the U.S. military ought to take a deep breath and watch what's happening in Ukraine and think about its ability to sustain its force for a long conflict. It has a lot of attrition, both in terms of weapon systems, people, munitions, again, something we haven't dealt with for 50, 60 years plus. How that's going to work. There's some things to double down on, what you're calling the software, the human domain of battle. I think the U.S. military generally gets that right, especially at the middle to low levels in the military. There's units have got a lot of cohesion. They've got generally very good leadership at the junior level. They're empowered with discipline initiative, the idea of mission command, and in their operations and their training, they do that quite well. I worry about that upper half of the military, though, and how bureaucratic it is, what the timelines are to get things done, how much intense resistance to rapid change is there, especially in peacetime, but that will translate immediately into the same kind of problems in wartime. So there's much to be gleaned here for any kind of fight the U.S. military may be involved with in the future. And again, both good news stories that should be emulated and cautionary tales that would apply very much to the U.S. military if the U.S. Armed Forces found themselves in a big conflict with a major adversary. I think those lessons we're still going to be gleaning here in the months to come.
There's a couple things that were raised. I have a question on air defense, which I want to come back to, but I want to turn to Mr. Kofman really quickly. The same sort of concept in question is, after Georgia, we saw the sort of new look reforms really catalyzed within the Russian military, which had been a debate that was going on, but a change to a lighter, more specialized, more focused military. And now we see a shift to mass mobilization. I'm curious granted, it's very early days, we don't know how the war is going to end, but what potential direction do you see the Russian military's operating concept or reforms looking like in a post-Ukraine world?
Yeah, it's very hard. Here's the truth. Right now, while the Russian military is in the war, they're focused on how the military should be structured to stay in the war. The current leadership, to be frankly honest, is quite old. Shoigu, Gerasimov, 67. They're sort of this last generation of generals who formed over years, to some extent, the Soviet military. Their general take that the Russian military going into the war was a halfway house. It sort of hedged on all sorts of different sides of the equation. The New Look reforms were then reformed again, and the Russian armed forces went back to the addiction of partial mobilization because they wanted greater force structure, they wanted more equipment, more gear, they didn't raise manning levels, okay? And what happened was they began to make compromises on the initial compromises, right? So sometimes strategy fails because the choices are wrong. Other times it fails because there are no choices, but other times it fails because people then begin to compromise on what they said they were going to do, right? And like the theory of success disappears. So my view of it is that that military was referred by some analysts essentially a cosplay Soviet military. It's neither a professional permanent standing force, nor a real Soviet army with a mobilization base or the equipment for it, or a mobilization program that could generate that amount of kind of manpower and military power. So none of these things, as they say in Russian, neither meat nor fish. Okay, so what is the takeaway of the Russian military leadership right now? I'm not going to speculate on what's going to look like 10, 20 years from now. Well, they think that the real problem of the Russian military is that it wasn't Soviet enough. Okay, that's the issue. And so they are going much more towards larger formations, mobilized army with a lot more conscripts that they're hoping to then classify as contract servicemen, build out more divisions out of brigades, and have a lot more equipment, maybe all older quality things they pull out of storage, but essentially to proceed much more down this path and focus much more on quantity, building up the size. The main problem is this is very unrealistic, okay? Because it's attempting to build kind of like a smaller Soviet military. And there's a very obvious reason why Russia can't do it, because Russia isn't the Soviet Union. I was born in the Soviet Union. Russia's not the Soviet Union, I'm sorry. It doesn't have the population, the economy, the defense industrial base, it just isn't. So it can't build a Soviet army at the end of the day, all right? And that's the real challenge with the folks currently in charge. But they're not going to shape the future of the Russian military, right? Neither Gerasimov nor this crop of generals are going to be its future. They're going to be on their way out either during this war or after it. The question is, what's the takeaway that the Russian military will take from this war? I'll bottom line this. So I think the things that are typically easiest to restore are capability, okay? I think the things that are harder are redoing kind of the force design, rethinking the force structure. And I think the things that are hardest is changing military culture. Now, it's very hard to kind of change military culture by design. No amount of PowerPoint briefings are necessarily going to get you there. So military culture often changes, if it's going to, as a result of a major loss or a serious crisis or catastrophe of the kind they're experiencing. And to be honest, I think that this war is going to be the most formative war in Russian military history since World War II. Because a lot of Russian military culture stemmed from the Soviet experience in World War II at the end of the day. It wasn't that shaped by Afghanistan. It wasn't nearly that shaped by the wars of the 1990s and 2000, but this war certainly will make an impact. It's too early for me to predict what impact that will be, okay? But I think it will prove formative for the future of Russian military and will drive some changes.
I'm cognizant of your time. Unfortunately, you have to step off about 5 minutes to 11. I want to give you a chance of sort of a last minute remarks or things that we should be watching, but that we're not watching. And then I have a few questions for General Barno and Dr. Bensahel before we wrap up. So final thoughts before you have to step away.
I mean, look, I don't want to add too much to what I already said. I really actually was fascinated to hear Nora's and Dave's thoughts. I think the big takeaway I want to offer is that this war has important lessons for us. We have to be careful not to take self-validating lessons early on and not to kind of assume that, well, Ukrainians are doing well because they're more like us. I really stick closely a bit to what late Dave Johnson used to write. I think we're really going to miss him. His commentary over the past year said that we should look at this and ask ourselves the key question: can this happen to us? Right, as Dave said, that we're not just going to awesome our way to victory. Can any of these things happen to us, and not to have intellectual alibis? That Russians are bad or they can't put together. And last comment on this, as Nora said at the beginning, look, there's also not necessarily secular trends in decline or rising power. Declining powers don't necessarily stay declining. Rising powers don't necessarily stay rising. So you shouldn't assume a secular trend in Russian power. Russia always tends to hang around no matter how often people write it off. That's why it's the main kind of like imperial power still left around Europe. Most importantly, okay, military power needs a context to express itself. There's no abstract rating where US is number 1, China's number 2, and Russia's number 3. These are not NFL league teams, okay? And even then, war is not a sporting match, okay? But even if it was, with a fixed football pitch and rules of the game that everybody sticks to, how many times have you seen your team show up to a championship game and perform far worse than you thought they were going to on that day, right? So we have to be thoughtful and not have these assumptions that the Russian military did badly. So they're going to do badly in every context in the future moving forward. And also that, if we do particularly well in one war, that means we're going to do great in the next war too, in a totally different context, different scenario against different adversary with a different set of allies. So I'll close on that, and I have to run, but I really appreciate the opportunity and invitation.
No, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hosting you again in the future, and best of luck with what I'm sure is a very busy diary today. Dr. Bensahel and General Barno, one of the questions that came through from the audience was the role of air power in this fight, particularly thus far, which has seemed to be underwhelming. But then particularly looking forward is if we look to the Ukrainian offensives after the Russian offensive, which is underway right now, can the Ukrainians sustain a forward momentum in the absence of air power? And do they have enough air power to achieve any sort of breakthrough in the near term?
Well, this has been a very interesting and surprising war with respect to air power, especially the traditional ways of thinking about air power. You know, the long-standing doctrine has been you achieve command of the air as soon as you possibly can. You destroy the enemy's air force if possible on the ground, and you rule the skies. That's the U.S. Air Force has been, you know, wedded to that since its very origins, and that's how we have fought the major wars we've been involved with. Certainly, Second World War being the epitome of that in many respects. And we're not seeing that kind of fight happening in Ukraine, partly because of the density of air defenses and the number of weapons that are now available to challenge the skies. In the past, it might have been, you know, a limited amount of air defense missiles that could be suppressed by, you know, our own aircraft with electronic warfare, with anti-radiation missiles, et cetera. We, you know, in the opening days of the Iraq War in 1991, and again in 2003. The U.S. Air Force and our other air arms took down the air defense networks and the missile systems that would be a significant threat to them. That's not happened in this war. Plus, there's been a proliferation of capabilities that can take down aircraft, and both sides have had to deal with that. You know, the Ukrainian Air Force as well is dealing with that on the Russian side. The Russians are dealing with that on the Ukrainian side. But an interesting adjunct we're seeing in this war is the convergence of both air power, as we've conventionally thought about it, fighters and bombers, with drones, and the degree of which drones are populating the battlefield and filling the airspaces in there and performing roles that in the past we've only seen done by manned aircraft. And so there's an air war within the air war going on for that seam between the surface of the earth and, you know, 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet or higher, where drones are now operating with abandon, some of which are very simple and off-the-shelf things that the Ukrainians are modifying to, you know, drop, you know, munitions on the Russians. And so there's a whole range of different things happening in the air that make this unlike any other air contest we've seen before. But I think we're going to see this degree of a stalemate in the air continue. And I think the Ukrainians are going to have to deal with contested airspace if they go on the offensive, much as the Russians have done, you know, over the last couple of months.
Dr. Bensahel, one of the biggest elephants in the room that we have not discussed, or we're unfortunately going to be discussing right at the end of the conversation, is China. What lessons do you envision that Beijing is drawing from this conflict right now? Obviously, it's a learning organization. They haven't fought a major land war since 1979. They respected the Russian military to a great degree, and it has failed to perform the extent to which they expected it would. What lessons do you think Beijing is drawing from, particularly in the view to Taiwan, but also more broadly?
And you gave me, 2 minutes to opine on that. Excuse me, I think there are many lessons, and one that I think is as true now as when we spoke 6 months ago, which is the Chinese military is not going to make the same mistakes that Russia made in terms of getting into a war without being fully prepared for a range of contingencies, right? Michael talked about how, Russia was actually not prepared, not postured, not ready to fight the war that it chose to initiate on its own terms. So China's not going to make that mistake. And I think that that's very clear. Beyond that, I think a lot of it will depend on how this war ends. But I think that looking at the way that the West has come together, which was, we haven't talked about a lot of the, geostrategic implications of the war so far. Many of those will be unknown until the war ends. But I think it is remarkable how well the West has held together. When we met 6 months ago, we talked about that, how surprising that was, but we weren't sure with the winter weather and gas and energy. And I'm one of my jokes at the moment is that the weather gods are rooting for Ukraine. It's been a very warm winter that hasn't brought a lot of those issues into the fore. But still, I think that, some of those broader geostrategic lessons, what it means for China remain to be seen. But there I would caution, as Dave did, about drawing too many conclusions from this war about how China thinks about war or how a China-Taiwan scenario would unfold. There was a lot of insta analysis as the war started about, well, it means X, Y, and Z for Taiwan. I don't think we know that yet. And I think that we would be as we were talking about in terms of our own assessment of the US military, we need to be humble about what those lessons are until this war is further along or concluded.
Well, I can't thank you both enough for joining us today, 6 months after our first conversation. And I very much hope that we can reconvene in another 6 months' time to revisit this, as unfortunately, I don't believe this conflict is going to be winding down anytime soon. And at that point, I think we'll have even more information to draw from. So on behalf of myself and Chairman Rogers, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Representative Nye for closing remarks.
Well, Joshua, thank you for your capable moderation of a very interesting conversation and for helping build this panel. Dr. Bensahel and General Barno, thank you for your insights, for being back with us. As Joshua said, I think it would be great to convene if we do a 6-month again. We pray this conflict has ended, though it looks like it may very well be continuing. At the minimum, we appreciate your help in helping us learn the lessons that we need to learn for our thinking and analysis about this. As President Biden was in the region and actually in Ukraine this week, reflecting on the nature of America and a NATO commitment to this, it's very helpful for us to have a sense of the realities on the ground that you're observing and reflecting on for us. So we're deeply grateful to you for your continued participation in our conversations and for the great work you're doing for a larger audience on the understanding of this conflict. So thank you so much. We look forward to having you back again. And to all those who were able to join us or be able to watch the video, thanks for participating. And we look forward to having you again for another discussion soon. Take care.